it's giving me a very good excuse to connect to people that I really like and they are far away, and to kind of open these conversations broadly. And I'm very happy that we've been doing that locally. And I was just saying to Andy and Eve, I was at the college, the Schumacher College in England, a few years ago, doing my master's in economics. And at that time they were leading a master's called Ecology and Spirituality, and they used to lead evening sessions in a very special place in Dartington Hall, which is this area that Schumacher College is in. It's a beautiful place, and they used to run these evening sessions in a library, and they were quite special. So I've just instantly, when I saw them, I was brought back to those moments. So I hope we can have a little bit of that today in the way that we can. So Andy, I met Andy at the college, and then after I've done my master's, I stayed another year at the college, and I had the chance to work closely with Andy. We were involved in the holistic science masters, and we would, after each session, we usually go to his office and then talk about how it was and reflect together and talk to students and then come back. So I also have very good memories of that time. And I think the conversation today for me is a little bit of that. When I left the college 2 years ago, I guess, a year and a half ago, I came to Brazil, and now I'm part of this group that sustains Escola Schumacher Brazil here. And of course, education is at the core of what we do. And so I'm very happy that we're able to have this conversation, because when I left Schumacher, Andy was beginning to think about this new master's called Engaged Ecology, right? And so since then, I think a lot of his thinking evolved, and I know that Eve is a very close friend of Andy, and they do exchange a lot about education. So we thought it would be a good idea to open up this conversation with you all today. So maybe Eve, I know, and Andy, I know a lot of people here know you, but maybe not everyone. So I would invite you to introduce yourselves, and then we can start in the way that we feel makes sense right now.
Yeah. Maybe I'll introduce myself first, and then Andy, you can go in and start us off. So first of all, I'm just so happy to be in lockdown, because otherwise I wouldn't get to talk to all of you. And that's one of the most amazing things, just amazing to be able to do this. So thank you to Bia and to Andy and to all of you to kind of carve these moments of time in such strange and exquisite and painful times that we're in. So I know the Schumacher College and Satish 27 years. I went there first when my second born was 7 months inside me. So I feel I was pregnant for much more than a son, because I went back to South Africa and I co-founded something called Lyndoch Eco Village, the first mixed income eco village in South Africa, as a post-apartheid gesture, a breath into what could look like something different. And also the Sustainability Institute, where I was founding director for 16 years. There's many gray hairs that came with that. And then my joy was to always have Schumacher College as a point of spiritual and ecological reference in my life. And I went back in 2015 to something with the outrageous name called Becoming Indigenous, which was a very intense and extraordinary journey. And just out of that, I met Andy. Newly out of that, and his great thing at the time was having twins, which were born premature. So we started teaching a degree shortly afterwards, where it was the first degree. It was the most extraordinary degree, ecology and spirituality, in the most extraordinary space. And I hope we could share a little bit of that and then what it's morphed into. For me, I have something called a Bertha Fellowship, which is an independent inquiry into the power and art of retreat. The most radical thing we can do sometimes is retreat. And I've linked it to so much of the work in South Africa and at Schumacher in retreat-based learning. And I hope that this time where Andy's brewed engaged ecology and I've brewed my fellowship in retreat, that they will come together again. And that's my introduction into being with you. And to, again, thank you very, very much for the invitation, Bia.
Thank you, Eve. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. My computer is telling me that my internet connection is unstable, so I hope I don't freeze. Yes. It's, yeah, as Eve says, it's really lovely to meet you all, and it is one of the blessings of this really strange time we find ourselves in, that we have these moments of connection, what I think the internet was designed for. And you're also in my thoughts and prayers. I understand it's tough in Brazil at the moment for many reasons, and I know things are not going particularly well there. So yeah, I'm thinking about you all. That said, they're not especially good in Britain, where our government is perhaps less incompetent than yours, but not far behind. So I'm a senior lecturer at Schumacher College. I came here 3 years ago, as Eve says, just after my twin boys were born, 10 weeks premature. So I arrived in a crazy state of madness on this extraordinary program, Ecology and Spirituality. And I've managed to stay here ever since, even though that program isn't running anymore. It was very popular, but it proved a difficult business arrangement with the university that was validating it. And yes, I'm involved in creating this new program, Engaged Ecology. I'll say more about that in a bit. But the question is, why me? Why am I here? How did I get this gig? I started out life as an ecologist, a scientific ecologist, and I did my first PhD and got very disillusioned with scientific ecology. This was back in the early 90s. I was young, I was idealistic, I was radical, I was a hippie. Well, still am, but I had long hair and I dressed from head to foot in purple. I wanted to change the world, and I realized that that wasn't going to happen through the academy. And so I went and became an environmental activist and on the front lines of various campaigns, mostly against the building of new roads in Britain. And I lived in a tree house for a while and did all that kind of stuff. And through a very bizarre set of circumstances, I got invited to do a second PhD in the study of religion. Maybe I will tell you the full story, actually. So I was burnt out from being an activist, as so often happens with activism, and I really didn't know what to do with my life. I'd given up this career as an ecologist, and so one full moon on a rather stormy night, I went out to a hill behind my house, just outside Oxford, and I prayed, and it was quite a heartfelt and visceral prayer, and I think it went something along the lines of, what the fuck do you think I should be doing? What the fuck should I do? And then 2 days later, the phone rang. This was before we all had mobile phones. And it was a chap called Graham Harvey, who became my second PhD supervisor. And he invited me to do a second PhD in the study of religion, this completely new discipline to me. 3 years funding. I mean, it's just crazy, right? So I did a second PhD in the humanities, in the study of religion. And the weird thing is that I came out of that PhD a rather reluctant atheist. I'd been exposed to so many rational theories of religion that I felt the world was probably meaningless. And I was very reluctant, and I was very sad about that. That's not a position I hold now, but I think it's quite an interesting sort of twist of fate that I went and prayed. My prayers were answered, and then I came out an atheist. Some might call me ungrateful. So I have this dance between being on the one hand a scientist, on the other being in the humanities, and they do that like two snakes coiling around a staff. But I also have a dilemma between being an academic and being a hippie, because I am still a hippie, really, as you may have noticed from the things behind me. There have been times when I've given up hippiedom and been fully into academia, and I felt a part of my soul was missing. And then there's been times when I've abandoned academia and my mind has not been satisfied. I love what academia brings. I love critical thinking. I love that clarity of thought. I love knowing how people have thought about the world and the problems of the world. I find it helpful. And I find it infuriating and annoying, and it can miss the point. It can miss the living, beating heart of what it is to be alive. And so when we're talking about education, I stand on this sort of fault line between, on the one hand, loving academia and hating it, and being completely a spiritual person, and you wouldn't even believe the things I believe. And there's this sort of electric tension between the two. I'm also very aware that the problems of the world that we face are products that the West has created and Western systems of thought and knowledge have created. And I wanted to read you a quote from, well, it's not a quote from this book. This book is called Decolonizing Methodologies by Linda Tuiwai-Smith, who's a Maori indigenous scholar from New Zealand. But she's quoting a woman of color called Audre Lorde. And it's a beautiful quote. And it goes like this: "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." Wow. So here I am as an academic trying to create an education, a new master's program addresses the issues of our time, but I'm using tools from the master's house to try and demolish the master's house, if that makes sense. And can it be done? Well, I don't really have the answer to that right now. Ask me in 5 years' time, when the course has been running for a while. But this is a first iteration. It's a first attempt for me. And the genesis for this program, I could talk for ages, so I'm just noting the time. I'll try and talk for 5 more minutes and then hand over to Eve. As Eve has said, the genesis of this program arose from the ashes of ecology and spirituality, this attempt to look at what role spirituality might have in our current ecological and social crises. This isn't a complete carbon copy of that old program, but it contains elements of it. And so it arises like a phoenix from the ashes of that program. But it also arose from conversations with students at Schumacher here in England. When we sat down with the cohort before this one and said, what kind of degree would you like in an ideal world? And they said, we would like a program where we did stuff, where it was based on practice. So we went and did stuff with our hands, and then we reflected upon it with our hearts and with our heads. So this is, as I'm sure you know, one of the cores of the Schumacher mission is head, heart, and hands. And, you know, as a teacher, I'm always trying to get students to read more. You know, that's how you traditionally get a good degree, is you read, and you read voraciously and capriciously. So I kind of rolled my eyes at this. Yeah, oh yeah, you just want to get out of reading. And I thought it couldn't be done. And then I had this brainwave, and I thought, hold on a minute, they're really onto something here. So this new program, everything begins with practice, with doing stuff with our hands. Let me just give you one example. And this is an idea that's just occurred to me today through conversations with ex-Schumacher students. I'd like to think about the climate. We're all talking about climate change, climate heating, climate emergency. But how do we engage with the climate around us? Well, one way would be to do a traditional Western scientific approach, and that would be to take measurements and every day measure the temperature, measure the wind speed, see whether there'd been a frost the night before, measure the amount of rainfall and so on, measure the air pressure, and somehow try and get a pattern of the climate through taking measurements. Another way would be every time you wake up in the morning to open the door and smell the air and just observe the weather and see how it makes you feel, and keep a journal. And if you did this really over a number of years, I'm sure one would get a feel for the weather and how it's changing and what feels right and what feels wrong. So I happen to have grown up very near to Schumacher College, 5 miles away. I know the weather because I grew up here. And I can tell you now that this long period of sunny weather we're having is really odd. Normally we would have more rain in May. But another way we could engage with the weather would be to build a kite, a single string kite, to make a kite and go and fly it and feel the winds and feel why the kite flies and why it doesn't fly. That would be another way. And another way, which I've learned today, would be to build a musical instrument powered by the wind. You can build what's called an aeolian harp with this great long piece of string that you attach to a tree and round your belly, and it vibrates as the wind blows, and you can make extraordinary sounds with it. And all of these are different ways of engaging with the world, and they allow us to they make us engage with the world in different ways. They make us think about the world. They include certain things and they exclude certain things. And so the point of this experiment in an alternative education is to try out these different ways of engaging with the world and see then, in the light of our reading, how we make sense of them. That's probably a good point to just pause and let Eve come in.
I like the idea of building a kite, actually. Yeah. So I think at the time, the ask of the times is uncertainty. And the danger of accredited degrees that are done in trendy or even supposedly radical ways is that we use the master's tools to supposedly break down the house. But what we do is reinforce this colonized mind. And I've said, I get, we are all modern, we are all colonized. And where's the room for the uncolonized creativity and imagination? And so my guess is this time where we have a chance to, I don't know, be different. Just to be different. What would it look like to connect to a tree? You know, at the college, we have this huge, ancient yew tree. What would it really mean to draw it, to sit with it at night, to know what lives there, to write it poetry, to sing to it, to sing with it, to understand who all lives in that tree. Underneath it, in the roots, what do they connect with? And I bet in all our places we have some gesture of nature. And I bet if we rooted, to take the metaphor a bit further, if we rooted these extraordinary explorations that we seem to be asked now to fathom in a single and long, I don't know if I'd call it phenomenology. Maybe my body would feel exactly what the tree was feeling. But even if it didn't, if we rooted our experience in experience, we may start understanding the world differently. And the patterns that are so entrenched in what it means to be human, our families, our ancestors. I come from Southern Africa, has rich ancestral tradition. And imagine we understood the stories of the place that we are learning from. Imagine we were silent and we embodied the kite that Andy's asking us to make. We become that kite as we fly it and so the agency that we hold. Imagine we didn't try and analyze, repeat, regurgitate, compare. Those are so useful to be able to do. But imagine our degrees truly engaged us, all of us. And our conversations, you know, even if we're separate like this and we're online, that our experience was guided into nature again, into night, into a sky journal, a journal that marked what it might have been like to be a sailor of old, where you had to know the constellations. Imagine we understood the cosmos, and in that way we're able to bring it into our bodies, into ourselves. And that the gaze inward was exactly the same as the guided gaze outward. And it helped us be different, it helped us act differently. Because see, my fear, I can speak poetically, but I do so with reason, because my fear about, as we attempt to decolonize ourselves through using cool literature from Latin America or from Africa, we haven't at all been able to figure ways of knowing and ways of being and ways of seeing that take into account the invisible, that take into account our souls and our spirit, our yearning. Those ways don't take into account a yearning. And all of you, I bet you, if I had the privilege, just the privilege of learning your stories, I would be awed. I'd be amazed at who you were being in the world. And every single one of you, I'd ask the question, what are you doing that's absolutely, that makes you sure that you're not just replicating patterns from the past, that Andy talked about burning out, or we aren't acting in the world with this anger and pain and bitterness that a destroyed environment makes us feel. But then we act from that place of pain and bitterness, and we simply repeat. And so the world hasn't really changed the way we imagined it might. And I wonder if it's a plea, or if it's on bended knee, or a sense of awe and reverence, that we might gather our learning in ways, and our acting in the world in ways that were from a softer, gentle, funny, humorous, self-deprecatory. If we were able to find what the Mexican folklore, I think, calls the river below the river, if we were able to act from those places, then the world likely would be different. And that's a deep and often referred to as maybe the deepest of feminine, which is inside men and women and children, especially children. And I wondered if we were able, in the practice of an Aeolian harp, or the weather that I smelt and touched every morning, or mapping the seasons, or exploring the elements, not in weird woo-woo, hey shoo, like wow, no, but as a way of prayer. And again, a prayer Andy's articulated much better than I can, sometimes the restrictions of a fierce religiosity. But what if we found simple practices in our retreat-based learning that found our heart, and where those practices may be disciplined, that we do wake up and do something every day. We don't lie in bed, endlessly. But there's an ecstasy and a hilarity and an art. Sometimes I read my friends' Instagrams. I roar with laughter. I hoot with laughter. Andy's the worst. But at the same time, there's something so provocative, so beautiful, so I'm jolted, I'm provoked. So I don't mean that this kind of way of being is so pristine and pure. There's uproarious sex, there's great stuff to take, there's judicious use of plant medicine, there's extraordinary science and technology, but somehow they combine, and one reads a rhythm and a heartbeat. And in that, I think, is the space for the kind of connection that is really why we're here. And unless our degrees, with their failings, all their accreditations and their bloody boxes to tick, I get it. But unless our degrees can make space for the kind of creativity that Andy's talking about, I guess we miss another whole tide until another huge virus comes, depression and Bolsonaro's and, Boris Johnson's and the Hungarian and, the Filipino. We have such a chance now to change. We have such a chance now. And I can only say I feel really excited that it's not brand new stuff. It's just a way of crafting what's been there forever, but to re-find it. Yeah, I think I'll stop there too.
Yeah.
I was
Are
just
there any questions?
giving us a pause after this beautiful, yeah, hearing you too. My own reflection now is I've been, after I left Schumacher, and I think at Schumacher I was really able for the first time maybe to really feel that I was in a retreat, in not in a way that I was just laying in bed and just meditating the whole day, but to really be, I felt I was really able to, like you said, Eve, to look at the yew tree and to be there with it. And I think for me the biggest struggle is now being back to Brazil to kind of bring a little bit of this retreat aspect of what this experience brought to me. And I've been struggling a lot. So I'm although I'm engaged with the Escola Schumacher, and it's beautiful work, and every time I'm in these sessions, it makes me very clear why I'm doing this. But I feel like living in a city, and probably experiencing something might be experiencing something like that in London now, I'm finding it so hard to protect myself from what it means to be in a big city, and just then going back to old patterns of, now I'm back to be close to my family, and then all of the old patterns just instantly come back. And so for me, this is the biggest challenge I have been facing, that I just wanted to share with you all. And I would like to invite people, if you're okay, Andy and Eve, that for reflections also and questions, and we can take it from
Yeah, I would love
one of
to.
the twins with Andy. Hello.
I've been photobombed.
Oh.
Yeah. Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
No, I think thank you, Eve and Andy, for everything that you said. Really, also always good to hear some people like you to talk, since it's been a while. I was in the last course at Schumacher, so it's been a crazy ride since I left Schumacher to go back to Brazil in this situation. And I totally resonate with what you said, Bia. And I was wondering, Eve, because this learning from retreat is so important, because that's definitely what Schumacher gives us, being there in such a retreat. So you learn so deeply about so many things that you are not used to look at in the first place. I wonder, how are you managing to do this experience being locked down in a city? Do you have any practice that maybe you can share with us to regain this connection, even by going out in the window and feeling the weather, that it's so there's so many influences, human influences in this weather, that it seems like impure. Even I don't know how to explain this. So if you could talk a little bit more about, even if that's maybe not the topic of the education, the masses that you want to develop, but something that we can all try to get deeper into while not being in this amazing master that you're developing.
I'd love to comment to both of those, but I'd also just like to be sure, because of time, just to hear any other questions, and perhaps those are ones that then, if we could just listen to a few comments, any comments or observations. And you can't get it wrong, guys. You can't get it wrong. So anything. And then maybe Andy and I could both make a little summing up or responses, if that works for you, Bia.
Hi.
Hi.
So my name is Maria. And I've had only an experience with Schumacher here in Brazil, which is already wonderful. And I'm kind of like a Schumacher bug. I've been in everything because it's really, stirring up things inside. So thank you. I wrote down my questions so that I, kind of get it to where I want it to be. And it starts with just trying to process, because this idea of we are all colonized struck me very hard. And as a Latin American, it hit me with great violence to hear this being said. We are all colonized when we look at history of the world the way it is. And then I started breathing into it and, trying to understand where it hits me. And then I realized that the best way to approach it was to transform it into a question, and also to assume a different starting point, which is what part of us is colonized, and what part of us is the colonizer. And I feel that brings me to a different point of view that is actually about connections, and not about assuming that there's two sides to it, or two sides to a story, or just one story to be won or conquered. So I wanted to kind of bring this question as a question, but also, as a way of reacting as well. And it made me also to think in everything else that was said about the invisible, which I really connect to. And also nature, we can call this invisible or visible manifestation as nature. What part of us connects to nature as an exchange? And what part of us grasps to nature as we grasp for air the moment we're desperate? And I feel sometimes we grasp to this invisible as a way of a strong prayer, but also as a way of grasping for air. So I just wanted to bring those two questions.
And this is why we do this work, so that we could maybe stay here for a year to try and answer the questions, Andy, for ourselves as much as with you. Is there anybody else that would like to, even if it's totally different, it's just, especially if it's different, does anybody else like to comment or observe or ask?
Hi, Eve, Andy, Beatrice. I don't know if you can really see my face, sorry. Let me change very quickly. I'm Fernanda. I'm from Brazil too, but I live in Guatemala. I'm a textile designer. And so I work here in the highlands of Guatemala for an NGO that has a base. It's based here in Guatemala, but it's based in New York City too. And as a textile designer, developing textiles with Maya and indigenous women from these communities around here, I am constantly feeling pushed in between two very different roads. So the states and very capitalist way of thinking, even being an NGO, it still has a very capitalist way of thinking and managing its work. And on the other hand, I work directly with this woman, and I am always feeling like, and having this challenge of how to interact with them. And as you said, thinking of ways of not replicating what I have from the States coming to me on, like, we have to sell, we have to produce, and how to communicate this with them in a way that I am not just passing the same things that I am receiving from above me. So it's a constant challenge for me in my work, but it's something that I would love to hear if you have any, if you guys have any thoughts about this.
if there's not anybody else, maybe Andy, would you want to just respond, and then I will? What's our time frame, Bia? We were doing this an hour? I just want to check.
I was realizing that we didn't actually speak about that, about the time.
Okay, all right.
So
we'll just go
it
as
wasn't
we
open
go.
to everyone's availability. So
Okay. All right. Andy, would you like to respond a bit, and then I will?
Thank you. Oh, they're all excellent questions, and I would that we had 3 weeks to to dissect them. This tension, Fernanda, that you mentioned between, you know, the Western NGO way of doing things and then this other way of doing things, this comes up time and time again in discussions in our classes here at Schumacher. And me and Eve have taught a course here on sacred activism, where we look at exactly these issues. And that's what Eve was putting so beautifully. How do we act in the world without repeating the violence? And there's no easy way to square the circle, because we want to do good in the world, we want to act in the world, and therefore we join NGOs, but we end up ticking boxes and trying to please managers and please funders, and we can miss the point of why we're even there. I think the answer is in what Eve has been saying, is something about doing things differently by coming back to experience. And I am a musician. I'm not a very visual person, so my metaphors tend to be sound-based, but I love the idea of that we're active listeners, that what we're trying to do is listen. And I was having a conversation with someone this morning when we were saying you can listen with your eyes. It's not just something you do with your ears, but there's something about the way we do things in the Western mindset. This colonizer mindset is to come in with a plan that we impose upon the world. It's like we're trying to make the world fit a plan, and rarely do we just go in and listen. And I'm also thinking of a beautiful dissertation that a Brazilian student did last year called Rita on a regenerative project in a favela in Sao Paulo, where this derelict corner of Sao Paulo, in this favela, was turned into a thriving garden and hub of workshops and things. And it was done by grandmothers who had all lived in the country when they were children, and they brought this sort of, it wasn't totally indigenous knowledge, but it was certainly not totally Western knowledge, this different way of doing things. And they just listened to the land, and they didn't plan anything. They just put plants here because it felt right, and they put a path there because it felt right, and they put a building there because it felt right. And it sort of emerged through listening to the place and listening to the land. How you apply that in your work, we would need longer to unpick that and unravel, you know, what your heart is telling you. But there is this deeply ingrained view in the West that the world is a sort of blank sheet, and we come at it with our cookie cutter and our plan, and we arrange things, you know, and we need a better plan, and that plan isn't working, so let's put a better plan on. And this, to me, is the fundamental problem, and this is why I'm suggesting that we make a kite and listen to the wind, or listen to birdsong. We have to listen. We just have to stop and listen, and then we're listening to ourselves, and we're listening to the world, and we start to tune ourselves. Another musical metaphor, but we start to resonate, and then we can act differently. Eve, I think that's probably a good place to bring you in.
So First of all, I'm spellbound at those of you who have spoken, at how articulate you, how well you articulate where you are at. And I just feel, sometimes Satish says that when somebody says, what's going to happen with the college and what's, who's going to manage, he says, Schumacher College is inside all of us. So whether one's experienced it at the college itself or at Escola in Sao Paulo, you all have that. And that's an incredibly beautiful thing to listen to. And I'm just going to try and make some threads. Is this unbelievably sophisticated way of saying what part of us is colonized, what part of me is colonized, and which part of me is the colonizer? I think that's a question. The pain of saying we're all colonized and what that triggers in me. The exploitation, the violence, the sheer brutality of human on human, of ways of being that are superior, supposedly, over those which are primitive. These create an agony. And in that agony, I think that it's so hard to bear that there's a split. With, okay, well, I'm not colonized, or I would never be a colonizer. And this beautiful way that you've been stirred up, Maria, that asks that question, like, how can I take it into myself? And look at what that really means. Because otherwise forever there's this dualism, of the terrible bad and the very good. And it's funny how we're always the very good. I've noticed that about myself. I'm just amazingly, amazingly good. My God, I am so boringly, until I find out, there she is. That one where the dark can come like a panther that sits here on our shoulder. And that's the part that I think we have to explore as activists. Openly, clearly, and hold that tension. So when you say the grasping, I love that so much. The grasping for air, the grasping for nature, please heal me. What do I give? Where's the reciprocity? Stefan used to say how he wondered how was it for the tree to be touched as a gesture, or how would it feel to be the tree? And he would try and help us turn it around. And the same as you say, turning to the invisible, are we not doing that just as another bloody gesture to pull into ourselves to feel better? And you're just so right. You're just so right. I guess sometimes we do that. And then there's those sometimes where we've paid sufficient homage. Can I use that old-fashioned word? A little bit like worship. And where we ask ourselves, we ask the universe, we ask whatever is the cosmos, use me, use me. It's a different form of giving. And I think this, Andy's spoken, but I want to link it back to the beginning comments, the be as beautiful, and the one, I'm sorry I didn't see your name, that was talking about was sort of, in a way, it's back in the real world. I was in this retreat, not this lying around smoking weed retreat or lying on our beds, but just this deep retreat of exploring who I on earth am I. And then I'm back in this world, like was the world that's working with a Mayan woman, or I'm working in a world that demands that boxes get ticked. How do you do that? How do I live in London? How do you live in your cities? And the only thing I think I can say is that we can be indigenous to any place at any time in history. In Lagos, in New York City, in Sao Paulo, in London. There's a way of being where the magic is in urban spots. Might if I have to look a little bit further or need a tank for oxygen in the pollution. But there's a wisp of guerrilla gardening or food gangsters or just a park with the biggest tree. And even in those moments, they may not be wilderness, but that opening, I think of this a little bit strongly at the moment, this one where we have an open heart, an open front, and a very strong spine. And that tensions that you refer to, the capitalist US and the ways of being that's softer with indigenous, with local women, or the instead of grasping for nature, to be able to be there with her. The retreat doesn't just belong in retreat, it's in everyday life. And perhaps the most radical thing we can do, the most subversive thing we can do, is to be silent. Yeah, is to find in that listening that Andy talked about, this deep listening. I think about it now as bearing witness, where you're just there. You're there, and suddenly I want to end with this. Actually, this is the story that came to me, is when Andy and I were teaching last year. I don't know if the years are going faster. I think it was still last year. Sacred activism. There was this beautiful, amazing group, very small group. And the way we worked with it was each person's story became our course, became our journey. Each person's story became the river that we were in. And one was someone from Brazil called Flavia. And she had worked with, she won't mind if I tell this, she had worked with villagers in a community, and the river that that community had been with for generations, had been utterly polluted by a factory further up the river and well within Bolsonaro's regime and approval. And the river died. The pollution was such that not only was the river dead in itself, but the villagers started dying too. And they weren't dying because they were ill, they were dying because their hearts were, they couldn't live without the river. They couldn't be there in that way. And Flavia came as one of these, some of his terribly thin, and I think our Western world would be burnt out, but you could feel that she couldn't find her own angel. I will put it that way. She couldn't find her angel. And she was telling the story, and with most of this, there was much room for tears. And part of our journey had been going to the moor, to Dartmoor. Some of you will remember what I'm talking about, this ancient moor with the land is filled with mystique and with mystery. And a week before, Flavia had washed herself in the river. It was cold. She washed and washed herself in the river, and we'd left her to be alone with it. And the next week, as she was describing the story of the polluted river, Andy just quietly said, I wonder if there's a way that you could keep going back to the clean river, a place which has pure and clean water like on the moor. And to those of us who go into retreat and come out, it's a very common practice to want to go and live in retreat because we imagine that that's where the purity is. It's not. It's bringing it into everyday life. but to be able to find the clean river to go and wash in often. And that may be the tenderness of a partner's hug. That may be profound meditation. That may be evening vigil with the moon. It may be the simple joy of watching a sunrise. All the best things in life are free. But those practices, as we weave them into everyday life, means that we could live in a slum in the heart of South Africa, or in favela in Sao Paulo, and the softness is tended like the garden that Andy referred to. The softness is tended and nurtured, because so much does the world matter that we start with ourselves. We tend ourselves in the same way that we would like to tend in the world. And I think that comes from holding these kind of courses that you guys are wanting to do, that Andy and I are wanting to do. And the struggle is what was referred to. It's the same struggle. There's the colonized way of an accredited degree, but how we subvert that, where you can still get your degrees, but at the same time you've done it in this invisible beauty, and the invisible beauty is what stays indelibly inside you, not the degree that you put on your wall, on a piece of paper. Thank you for those questions, because I didn't know I thought all of that. So that was a very helpful, that was very beautiful. Thank you for asking.
Whew. Thank you so much for the beauty you brought, and also the questions. I love them, especially what this thing about finding our colonizer, and that touched me a lot.
Perhaps we can breathe together. Perhaps sometimes if we don't have to talk, perhaps we could just breathe a little bit, Bia.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
So we do that, and then if there's anything,
maybe we can all unmute ourselves also, like this.
Yes,
breathing.
let's do that. Good. So we can hear each other breathe.
Yeah.
We just make ourselves comfy and feel our chairs and stretch a little bit. Go back in our bodies, become aware of our toes. In this beautiful universe that we live, we encounter all the time. And I love the little noises. They make me feel that you're close by. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Angie. Thank you, Eve. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. It was really special.
Thank you.
I loved it. Thank you so much, everybody. Much love.
Thank you.
And be well.
And be well. Be well in your country. Be well. Be well in yourself.
And I hope we all meet again.
Yeah.
Yes. Me too.
Okay.
Obrigada.
Okay. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Bia.
So good.
Thanks, Pia. Bye-bye. Bye, Annie.